All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes. We try to turn you on to some great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, concepts, discoveries that you probably wouldn't know about because they've been suppressed. And there are some people that do not want you to know this stuff for whatever reason. Could be because it's misinformation, or it could be that it could save your life, or that it could really help you in a pinch. And today is our 284th Bible Decode. We've been looking at the suppressed theory of the Roman origins hypothesis. That is that the Romans are the ones who actually wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews, who they had just defeated in a war from 66 until 73 AD called War of the Jews. But they knew how resilient the Jews were and that they were going to come back fighting, and so they wanted to mellow out the Jews or tame the Jews, to domesticate the Jews by using a Jewish Messiah who, instead of being a military commander, as many of the Old Testament prophecies talk about, that this Jewish Messiah was going to be a Prince of Peace and who was going to encourage rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' heavy backpack and turning the other cheek to oppression, just like a good Roman subject. And in addition, this Jewish Messiah was also going to be yelling and screaming at the Jews, overturning the tables of the money changers at the outer court of the temple, and castigating the Jewish merchants who are selling animals for the sacrifice at the temple. And so this is a textbook made Jesus, Jewish Messiah, for the purposes of the Romans. And then as you dig in further into the Bible, into the New Testament, you find that Paul is even more of a textbook case for the Romans. Now, this was done by the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, that is Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, his son, and his other son, Emperor Domitian, that ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. They wrote the story of Jesus and backdated all of the events by 40 plus years into the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius in 28 or 29 AD, and that's where the advent of the adult Jesus into Jerusalem occurs. And then you need to take a look at the history of this war between the Romans and the Jews, called War of the Jews, which is written by a fellow named Josephus, or Josephus. And this character was also known as Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. Even though he was born a Jew, he claims, according to his autobiography, that he was adopted by the Romans, by Vespasian, and made a member of his family, put up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and made one of the court historians for the Flavians, given plenty of resources in order to write this history, along with writing his, this is in 7 volumes. He also wrote a 20-volume history called Jewish Antiquities. And whoever Josephus was, when you read him carefully, with the right perspective, with an open perspective, you will realize that Josephus is also the author of the New Testament. Whoever he was, whether it was one person as a pseudonym of one of the Romans, or whether it was a whole team of writers working on this, the writer of the War of the Jews is the same as the writer of the Gospels. And you can see that in the myriad of parallels between the two texts, some of which are way, way, way beyond the realm of coincidence. And the sheer number of them also puts it also beyond the realm of coincidence. Now, another one of the suppressed theories that we're looking at, especially today, is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were a bunch of Hebrew scrolls. Now, keep in mind that the Gospels and Josephus are both written in Greek, which is one of the two languages that the Romans, along with Latin, they were mostly bilingual. In Judea, they spoke Aramaic, and very few people knew how to write. And Aramaic is kind of a derived, it's in the same family as Hebrew. The Dead Sea Scrolls are mostly in Hebrew. Some of them are in Aramaic, and there's just a couple of them that are in Greek. These represent these texts that were written by this small group of very, very dedicated monks that lived in this fortress near Qumran, about 20 miles from Jerusalem. And they had all of the Old Testament books, as well, many copies of some of them. And then they also had a lot of sectarian material that was specific to the sect, the group of monks that lived there. Things like the community rule and the temple scroll and the war scroll, the Damascus document, and many commentaries, or what you would call pashers, on different books of the Old Testament, especially the Habakkuk pesher, and there's one other one now that I can't remember, which is also a famous pesher for these Dead Sea Scrolls. And I believe when the Romans invaded their fortress in approximately 68 AD, they got wind of it, and they put all of their precious documents in these jars or vases that are really stylized and unique to Qumran. The craftsmanship is very high, and they were unique pieces of pottery, I guess is the word maybe I would be using for Qumran. And they put all these documents in these vases and put them in these caves nearby. And 1950 years later, these things were miraculously discovered by some Bedouins that were just happened on this cave, and they found some starting in 1947. And over the next 9 or 10 years, they discovered many, many more finds of cave in various caves. I think there's like 14 different caves that they discovered these things in. And somehow, which you can kind of find if you go over the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by Agent and Lee, which I've gone over on this channel. If you go back about 200 days, you can probably find those videos. These texts were given custody to these Dominican priests who were tasked with translating these documents into, Western languages, English and French and German, I suppose, and disseminating them to interested scholars and lay people alike. Unfortunately, these priests saw something that they didn't like, and so I believe something that might have been very embarrassing for them, and so they just really started to not publish these things and not do any of the dissemination, and really would do just kind of token translations where they would translate one document here, and then a couple years later another document, and the documents that they chose to translate were really innocuous compared to the other documents. And finally, almost 40 years later, in the late 1980s, Robert Eisenman and others made a big stink of it and started legal action against these Dominicans, many of whom had already died. And these Dominicans literally bequeathed the custody of these documents to their heirs. They were entitled to do that somehow, or they thought that they were entitled to do something like that. And so many of them had already died, and finally the documents got to see the light of day in the late 1980s. We're looking at a book from Robert Eisenman that's called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. And you may know the Maccabees, same name as some of the apocryphal texts that are about them. They were like a dynasty of Jews that basically bridged the gap between the Greeks and the Romans in terms of who was in control of Judea. So it was the Greeks up until approximately 167 BC, and for about a century the Maccabees had control, and then the Romans pulled in there in 63 BC. There was a little bit of a fluid period there between, and then the Romans pretty much took control under Herod the Great in 37 BC. The Zadokites, named after Zadok, one of the priests, high priests of David and Solomon's era, and then all of Zadok's heirs, and I believe the word also means righteousness, which also connects with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because in the Dead Sea Scrolls narratives there are three main characters: the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, and the liar. And so they kind of engage in a drama here, and Eisenman believes that these are directly tied to the story in the New Testament. He believes that the teacher of righteousness is actually James, the brother of Jesus, and represented the Nazarenes, the Jewish Christians who believed in following Jesus, but they also believed in maintaining the Jewish rituals and traditions. Unlike Paul, who was willing to abandon the Jewish rituals and traditions and sell out completely to Jesus, and really to try to convert the Gentiles. He was pushing toward the Gentiles, whereas the Nazarenes wanted you to, if you wanted to follow Jesus, you still needed to get circumcised, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the title of the book, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. We're in chapter 8, which is discussing this problems with paleography. I can pronounce paleography, but this is palaeography. There's an extra A in there, even though Eisenman doesn't put it in there, but other places I've seen it, it has an extra A in there, palaeography, which means the assessment of penmanship, of the penmanship of the writing of the text. You can kind of determine when it dates from. It's a way of dating documents, and it's not particularly precise, but it does kind of assess things according to the time period, the writing style, the penmanship style that was in vogue at that time. And the Dominicans used this palaeography for determining that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written way back in the 2nd century BC, pushing it as far away as they could from the life of Jesus, while Eisenman believes that there's plenty of evidence other than the palaeography to determine that the documents were written in the 1st century AD. Okay, so now his conclusion here is it should also be stated categorically that 68 AD is the terminus a quo for the deposit of scrolls in the caves. So this is the time period, really the ending time period. This is when the Romans, had taken over, and so that's when they put the documents in the caves. But it is not the terminus ad quem for the cessation of habitation in the region of Qumran, which it is generally taken to be. So he's kind of saying that they still live there, even after the invasion. Now, only in the case of the Damascus document, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, only in the case of the Damascus document are there any real difficulties, palaeographically speaking, for the above theory. But for the moment, we have made no claims concerning the date of this document, I guess in terms of the Damascus document. As to its relative chronology, we would agree with the palaeographers who see it as being somewhat later than the community rule, which is another one of the documents. It is only when putting in the pegs, as they are referred to by those in the field, that real differences would emerge. But Malik himself says that, and Abbe Malik was one of the Dominican priests, one of the leaders, that palaeographic evidence can be considered accurate only within 2 generations. And Deveau, who is the leader of the Dominicans, and Deveau admits that such evidence cannot be taken as absolute in and of itself, but must be ranged alongside textual, historical, and other kinds of data. The 2-generation rule presupposes a correct identification of the general chronological provenance of a given script in the first place, and barring this, the deviation could be much wider. Even where a document as crucial as the Nash papyrus is concerned, which is another one of the scrolls, where most scholarly opinion has ranged itself behind the religiously conservative Albright, due in no small part to the successful efforts of his students, and upon which most subsequent data has been constructed. Early voices such as Idris Bell of the British Museum and F.C. Burkitt initially represented a 3 or 4 century deviation from Albright. I mean, if you're talking like 3 or 4 century deviation, why even bother? I mean, I could probably look at the documents just and eyeball it and just say, oh, that looks like it's 2,000 years old. Well, that looks like it's only 1,000 years old. I mean, like, that's not even a science. That's just, you know, that's so, you know, uh, what's the word? Gross or just, you know, coarse. This is not any type of accuracy whatsoever. S.A. Birnbaum, who, along with Cross, has laid the foundations to this polygeographic structure, employs what in any other field would be considered the most pseudoscientific and infantile methods in determining these pegs. In this way, he adds new pegs to aid in determining the provenance and date of the next manuscript, and so on down the line. Far from homing in on the true dates of a manuscript by such a methodology, what he does, as any good student of mathematics will realize, is to compound his errors, increasing his margin of error exponentially. The methods of the other paleographers working in the Second Temple period do not differ markedly from his, though they are not quite so forthcoming in their presentation of them. All involve a certain amount of subjective reckoning based on the assumptions and preconceptions I have been at pains to upset in this study. Now, I'd like to remind you that we are just skimming the surface of this topic, according to Eisen himself even, because we're not reading the footnotes. Let me just tell you that we've read, I probably in 2 minutes I just read 6 pages, because there's only like, every page has like 2 lines of text and the rest of it is footnotes. So one of these days maybe we'll get around to reading and studying the footnotes, but probably for our purposes it's a little bit too advanced. I mean, I'm not saying that you're not advanced. It's too advanced for me, I'll just say that. And that I'm just trying to grasp the basic argument here, and then we can get into the weeds at a later time. So this is to say nothing of the other variables. For instance, that in a given community there might have been an archaizing conservative tradition, as for instance the Paleo-Hebrew script at Qumran. Even today, Samaritans use an archaizing script with roots going back perhaps some 20 centuries for biblical manuscripts, or that one might have been dealing with older scribes. Right, I mean, like, depends on whether, if your scribe is 20 years old, then they might be using the newest thing, but if the scribe is 65 years old, you know, they might be writing at the exact same time as the 20-year-old, but using an older script. So this is really, like he says, infantile type of science here. To posit for the purposes of argument the extreme case, let us assume that an 80-year-old scribe was sitting next to a 25-year-old scribe trained in a more up-to-date scribal school, whatever that might mean in such circumstances. Here, of course, is where Malik's margin of error comes into play. But this is hardly very comforting when we are using one manuscript to date another, as Birnbaum does, none of which with an actual dating formula. What date would 2 manuscripts copied by these 2 scribes at exactly the same time appear to be? If the older scribe copied a manuscript using the script he learned when he was 20, what date would we give a manuscript found in only 1 exemplar that was actually copied in 4 BC, or in 63 BC, or before? Suppose the older scribes' teachers themselves were all old or very old-fashioned. What then would be the margin of error? Or suppose that a given student just had not learned his lessons very well and made errors which look to paleographers either like scriptural developments or regressions. It is not possible to say on paleographic grounds that a manuscript was written in 63 BC and not, for instance, in 45 AD. In particular, when one has only one exemplar of a given work, the case, for instance, of all the Pesharim, or Peshers, at Qumran and many other texts, or when one has one older copy as opposed to several or a cluster of newer ones, the actual case of the Damascus document, one must exercise extreme caution. The best one can hope for is a rough relative chronology. Only when manuscripts begin to bunch up in clearly discernible manner is one justified in thinking in terms of possible dates. In any event, it is certainly incautious to date it by its earliest exemplar, however tempting this may be, as all scholars in the field rush to do, but rather where the distribution peaks. Yet Qumran scholars make these kinds of assumptions regularly, claiming a precision that comes down in some cases to a handful of years, while dismissing better theories than the one on which their own methodological assumptions are based. Right, Eisenman is interested in the text, that the evidence that the text itself provides is more powerful than the evidence of archaeological or paleographical evidence. He's not dismissing this method, but just putting it into its proper perspective as being, this is more of a secondary method. The real proof, the real evidence, the stronger evidence is the content of the texts as opposed to the style of them. I would like to state a rule of thumb that might be helpful. Paleographic data cannot in and of itself be considered definitive. Scholars who use it to disqualify an otherwise convincing picture, which in most other ways fits the available evidence, do so at their own peril. At no time can it be used to dismiss a theory which, within these general parameters, can make meaningful sense of an internal textual evidence. Where pegging is so precarious and in the general absence of secure date formula, meaningful textual evidence must be accorded precedence, as it is in any case by a majority of scholars, including even paleographers, as we have seen, albeit in a subconscious manner. Ultimately, we shall probably have to admit that the situation regarding paleography is much more chaotic and difficult to describe than was originally envisioned by Cross's and Birnbaum's assumptions of rapid straight-line development of scripts in the Second Temple period, which lie at the heart of their reconstructions and equations, such as they are. Such a circumstance, anyhow, would be more in keeping with the reality of the historical situation of the period, or Sitz im Leben of the period. Here, textual and historical studies will be able to play a role in helping to clarify the true, probably highly complex character of paleographic sequences not vice versa as heretofore. On the basis of internal textual data alone, namely the use of Habakkuk 2:4, Isaiah 43, Isaiah 10:29, Numbers 24:17, Deuteronomy 18:15, and the evocation of the terminology in Isaiah 53:11. In Qumran, communal organization and eschatological interpretations like those of Ezekiel 44:15 and Habakkuk 2:4, demonstrably all scriptural passages enjoying a vogue in first century Palestine, but not before, meaning first century AD Palestine, but not before, I believe. Although I suppose it could be both. One is entitled to conclude that almost all Qumran sectarian texts are late, mainly first century AD. Paleography will have to accommodate itself to these results, not vice versa. Such a conclusion, where sectarian works are concerned, implying as it does the fact of new ideological departures, is completely in keeping with Josephus's repeated allusions to innovations and innovators. Since the appearance of Judas and Zadok at the beginning of the first century, and the statements of in the ARN, can't quite remember what that is. I believe it's some kind of journal, some kind of scientific journal or historical journal, and Al-Kirkasani identifying the start of really destructive sectarian strife with the split between Zadok and Boethus, as well as the parallel, albeit highly refracted, testimonies in the New Testament and pseudo-Clementine recognitions, placing in conjunction the division of the people into many parties, the birth of the Sadducees, who, considering themselves more righteous, withdrew from the community, and the coming of John. So all those things occurred in the first century. And so these are the, what he calls internal textual evidence. Things that were referred to in the text, in the relevant text. And he's referring specifically to the destructive sectarian strife. So these different sects were being driven apart by various ideological splits,